Sure. So the research is kind of motivated by a lot of discussions in the media and in the policy circles about how important exports are, how important the migrant workers are in supporting the exports to China's growth in the last 10, 15 years. So we want to basically seriously look at that question and try to quantify those effects. And surprisingly, what we found is that the impact of migration is important, not in terms of supporting the trade growth, but more in terms of better resource allocation, move workers from low productivity provinces and sectors to high productivity provinces and sectors. And its impact on trade is actually quite small. So the growth of the trade is mostly due to the reduction in trade costs, for example, associated with WTO. But the interaction is very small. So that's kind of a surprising result. So I think probably the media is overemphasizing the cheap labor as a role for supporting the export growth in China. Yeah. So we find the cost of moving from one province to another, so cross-provincial boundary migration, the cost is still very high, extremely high. And the cost of, a lot of the reduction in the cost of migration that we look at in the data was due to the reduction in the within province rural-urban migration. However, because within the province, the productivity differences, even between agriculture and non-agriculture, is not that big compared to the cross-province, like inland and coastal productivity differences. So the gains from reallocation from the within province rural-urban migration is actually smaller than the interprovincial migration. And so, but that's exactly where the Hukou restrictions binding the interprovincial migration still. I understand that starting from like 2001 and so on, a lot of the lower tier cities, the migration the restriction on migration has been pretty much relaxed. So I think the gain coming from there within the local rural migration is not going to be very big, but there's going to be huge gains from cross-provincial, the interprovincial migration. And our estimate, the cost is still very high. So there was enormous potential. Yeah, so the numbers, I don't have the most latest numbers. So the numbers, we're using the numbers that we had from 2005, based on the cost there and compared to the comparable costs in the US. And say if China lower the interprovincial migration cost to the level that's similar to the US, so that China had similar labor mobility across provinces, then the gains on GDP growth will be 23%. That's enormous. Yeah. Well, I think two things. One is reduce the interprovincial migration costs, especially don't impose this restriction on population in the big cities, because that's where the high productivity area is, and that's where a lot of the migrant workers can potentially, and the agri-productivity gains coming from, is moving to those places. But the Chinese government is very worried about the big cities and impose getting tighter restriction now than before. I think that's counterproductive. And they try to encourage local migrations, which we showed actually the gains from that is very small. So I think that'll be the biggest policy recommendation. The second is related to the internal trade. I think there's still a lot of room for further reducing the internal trade barriers. For example, we know like Beijing, all the taxis in Beijing are Hyundai because they're joint venture with Beijing Auto. Similarly in Shanghai and every other city. That clearly is a local protection. They should get rid of that. That could also generate a lot of growth. Yeah, so I guess one of the things that we find in this study is that the trade, the reduction in the international trade costs, it was very important for generating exports, but its impact on aggregate GDP and on welfare is actually quite small. So the trade itself, export itself, doesn't give you that much gains. And it's what we find is that it's the associated reform that China has carried out, maybe in preparation for joining the WTO, like the reduction in the migration costs, the relaxation of Hukou restrictions, and the reduction in internal trade costs. That generated a lot of, that was contributed a lot to the growth in China during that period. So I think they cannot just think about the one opening up and export. That's it. They want opening up as a way to kind of encourage domestic reform. I think that would be a general lesson.